we were actually planning on talking about this topic before this. I saw this YouTube video, but I thought this one actually plays it quite well. So it's another video from PBD podcast from Patrick Bet-Davies of Valuetainment, and they have. Let me just turn that on for you. They reported that, like, we're talking about culture change, and there's this culture change in a lot of ministries right now. And I want to kind of talk about what's good culture change, what's not. And this story popped up about some transgender women, or are they transgender men? They are, no, whatever. Like they're men pretending to be women. Like that's what it is. That went and had lunch with the Pope. Now, I think this article has probably blown it a little bit out of proportion. I don't know, because it seemed like it was actually quite a large formal thing, and maybe these people were some of the attendees that were talking about ads. Look, why ads? It's this big dinner. Everyone's around. Like, there's lots of people around, and so maybe they were just some people that went along. They're like saying Pope had lunch with trans people. Well, that was probably some of the people that were there. Now, Dr. Rod, obviously this has been blown a little bit out. Maybe it hasn't, but like there wasn't too much to say there. But obviously the Vatican or the Catholic Church is, they're making this move to allow trans baptisms and trans godparents, and there's a lot of stuff that they're now moving away from tradition and with some things. First of all, the Pope having lunch with some trans people. I mean, I go back to, didn't Jesus eat with? That was a Freudism, whatever. Jesus had lunch with prostitutes and sinners and everything like that, and how are we meant to influence people if we can't have a relationship with them first? But is this right?
That's a good question. On the whole, I think he's wrong.
Okay.
Now, look, this is a pretty difficult area, really, and I'm sure a lot of Catholics will be wrestling with this. I don't think the fact that there were transgender people at a function is really the issue.
Yeah.
The issue is that this Pope has tended to display neo-Marxist thinking in economics, in social culture, and in religion ever since he became Pope. Now, it is significant that he's the first Pope from South America. He displayed, long before he became the Pope, the general traits of liberation theology, which is a neo-Marxist approach to understanding the Bible, and it has its counterparts in economics and in culture. So he's brought into the Vatican, I believe, an overall philosophy which is inimical to what God teaches through his word. But he's not alone in that, because many priests, many Christians, in fact, from Latin America do have strong liberation theology tendencies. Now, liberation theology is Marxist in the sense that it tends to put people into classes. That is, you're in the capitalist oppressor class, or you're in the worker or bourgeoisie oppressed class, and it is right and proper for the oppressed to rise up against the oppressors and, if necessary, kill them. And they do have a way of interpreting the life of Jesus as a radical, which I don't think has got any foundation biblically, but nevertheless, that's where it comes from. Now, look, I think the real damage which the Pope is doing is that he's blurring the boundaries between that which a Pope does as infallible and that in which the Pope is not. Now, Catholic theologians will understand that although the Pope is regarded as being infallible, the Pope, any Pope, is not immaculate. In other words, the Pope is infallible, that is, he's truly representing God when he's making statements of a doctrinal nature. But in other respects, say with an encyclical or public announcements or the way in which he behaves in public, he's not infallible because the Pope is not immaculate. In other words, everything he says and everything he does is not, as it were, directly communicating from God. Now, I think the really difficult issue for Catholics and for people like myself who are trying to figure out what he's on about is that when he speaks of things like there being many ways to God, but Jesus is but one. So, for example, not long after he took up the papacy, I should say the papacy, he said that Catholics no longer have to evangelize Jews. And he's made other statements since then, which point to universalism. He's made statements more recently about transgenders and gays being able to partake of communion, to be able to become godparents, even to take baptism. Now, I think the difficulty is this, that runs against long-held Catholic theology. The Catholic Church has been a very strong defender of expressions of human sexuality remaining within the confines of heterosexual marriage. It's been very strong on that. But the example that he's been setting of late undermines that strong doctrine of the Church. And I think that blurs the lines, at least in the minds of some Catholics, between that in which he's infallible and that which is not. I think he's done a lot of damage to the Catholic Church and continues to do so. And I suspect that many Catholics are turned off and may well leave the Church. Now, having said that, most churches will welcome transgender people, lesbians, homosexuals into their church. A church service is a public event, and anybody is welcome. You're allowed to attend. However, your attendance does not mean that the church needs to change its position. If it's a biblical position, that will not change across cultures and it will not change across time. The biblical position, although there are some theologians who disagree with this, but most theologians would argue the biblical position on sex is strong and unequivocal. The only legitimate expression of human sexuality is within a heterosexual marriage, a monogamous marriage for life. That is, it's an exclusive arrangement. Everything else is sin. Now, a lot of people don't want to hear that. A lot of people in the church don't want to hear that. But nevertheless, that's the biblical position, and politicians can rail against it. Politicians can throw Christians in jail if they want to. They cannot change what the Bible says. Now, I think the Pope is in grave danger of blurring the lines between that which a Pope does in his role as an infallible representative of God and that which he does as a fallible Christian. And I think that's the great damage that he's doing.
So what's, like, obviously, there's one thing in this video that links down below if you want to watch the whole thing, but Jeremy, who's the CEO of Daily Wire, was commenting on, and he made this statement that tradition is really important. I think that's one thing that our current culture, we're very quick to disregard the past. Everything in the past is bad, and so break away from tradition because all tradition is evil, tradition is oppressive, all those sorts of things. Obviously, tradition is important. However, how do you find that balance between, and kind of trying to bring this back to leaders, general leaders, but also leaders of local ministries and stuff, but a business leader. Traditions are important, but organizations have to evolve. So how do you find that balance with still respecting tradition, but growing as an organization, growing as a ministry, growing, how do we make that change? Because I suppose the thing is obviously there's, we've spoken about previously about the UMC, the United Methodist Church, that they're having their issues with the LGBT pastors and all that sort of stuff, right? And then on the other side, you've got, we spoke a few weeks ago about the Southern Baptist Convention banning women pastors and all that sort of stuff. And I know we're gonna transition into talking about that in a minute about the Bible verse of that. But you've got one that is evolving, and then the other one that is traditional, and they're both doing it wrong. So, how do we find that balance?
Well, look, I think a really, really important thing is to understand that history matters.
Yeah.
Tradition is something that has historical roots.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the big mistakes we've made with our education systems in the West over the last perhaps 50 years is that we've undervalued history.
Yeah.
As a result, we don't have much of an identity because our identity is very largely determined by our history. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the reasons why we have so much angst in our culture today is that we don't know what our identity is because we're not telling the story of our history.
Yeah.
So, I often talk about the story of Christianity when I'm preaching. I probably, in at least half of my sermons, I take people back to Genesis.
Yeah.
Because Genesis, particularly chapters 1, 2, and 3, are so important to understanding what Christianity is all about.
I have a little bit of a chuckle because you do reference.
I know, I do it a lot. It's really important. It's really important. And church history matters. So, for example, a little earlier, we were talking about what you might loosely label as Christian communism. And the only evidence that ever happened was in relation to the early church in Jerusalem, where it was probably a wise thing to do because the destruction of that city was about to happen. Yeah. It's really important to understand something about church history. And the same for our nation. The United States has just celebrated Thanksgiving. I think it is important to understand that the experience of those pilgrims, the first, there was just over 100 of them in the first wave of pilgrims. It's really important to understand how and why, and even that, roughly half of them died in their first year. It wasn't because they ran out of food. There were other reasons for it. It's really important to understand the role that the local Indians played. It's really important to understand something about their resilience. Just think about it. How many of us today would have had a 3-day celebration after half of the population had died? That's often regarded as the first ever Thanksgiving. History really, really matters. Thanksgiving in the United States, it's not really about the turkey. Yeah. Although the meal often revolves around turkey. Now, there was turkey at that so-called first Thanksgiving. My understanding is the Indians were the ones who got it all. They were sort of, brush turkeys. very different to the farmed turkeys we have today. But the fact that there was a form of communism imposed on those pilgrims because of the agreement that they had with those who financed the establishment of the colony, and it just didn't work. It didn't work because some people were lazy, some people were sick, and those who had to do all the work resented it so much that they just decided they didn't want to work as hard. And they came to the realization that the system which had been imposed on them by those who had provided the finance wasn't going to work. And so that was really how the system of capitalism, which became embedded in the United States, was established. That's a really important story because it helps explain why it is the United States is like it is. Now, that story is under a lot of strain today because people are trying to tell a different story, which almost certainly is historically inaccurate. But because people don't know history, they don't know that they're being told a story that is inaccurate. And so the first thing is know your history. And I think in the corporate context, if you're the leader of an organization, the history of that organization really matters. Do some research in terms of the founders and how, particularly if it's an older business, what was their original vision? What were the values that they brought into that business? And talk about it. And talk about how that compares with what exists in the business today. And then talk about those things that might need to change. Now, almost certainly, one of the things that will need to change is technology. Because if you're taking on the reins of a company which is 100, 150 years old, clearly the technologies that were employed back in those early days are not going to be relevant today. Communication will remain relevant, but the technologies that you use for communication purposes are going to be very different. You'll have a much more highly educated workforce than might have been the case 100 years ago. You'll have people with different aspirations than might have been the case 100 years ago. Take all that into account, but don't ignore history. Celebrate those good things in history. Celebrate the milestones, the first $1 million in sales. Maybe that occurred in 1922. That's worth celebrating. I don't think you should ever denigrate history. It's right and proper to recognize that we've made some mistakes in history. Human slavery, for example, was a mistake and remains a mistake because it's still going on. But I don't think you should throw away a whole culture because the culture made some mistakes in the past. We should recognize those mistakes and say, you know what? We've learnt from that, and we don't have to organize our business or our society on those lines into the future. I don't see the celebration of corporate histories happening very often these days. And I think it's very sad. I think it's wrong because I think an organization is stronger if it recognizes its history. And hey, look, if in the early days of a company, it had appalling policies towards the environment, just face up to say that was the case. You know, we chopped down a whole cedar forest, for example, that will never regrow. And that's not a good thing. We're sorry about that, but we've learned from that. We've learned the lessons of history, and we're taking more care of the environment today, which, by the way, if you're a Christian, you should be concerned about the impacts of your activities on the environment. That doesn't necessarily mean we should preserve the environment, but we should be aware of the impact of our activities on the natural environment, and we should prayerfully consider what we might do to mitigate those impacts. We could talk for a month on this, Craig. We really could, and I think it's a really important thing.
Which we're not going to talk for a month because we're having the next month off. Hey, you've just watched an excerpt from the On the Cube Leadership podcast. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If it challenged your leadership or inspired you in some way, put a comment below. And if you want to watch the full episode or more content like this, check out our channel. And hey, consider subscribing while you're there.